and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. We're honored to have Arnaud de Borchgrave here in the studio with us. Mr. de Borchgrave is the Executive Director of the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also had a distinguished journalism career with Newsweek and with UPI International, which still...
And I'm still doing 2 columns a week.
And you are an inspiration to all of us. Arnaud, we're talking about this deal that's been reached with Iran. In the 30 years of extreme animosity that has existed between the United States and Iran, where does this factor in that relationship?
I think to understand the whole situation, you have to go back to 1968 when Harold Wilson, then the Prime Minister of the UK, said we have to abandon all of our obligations, security obligations, east of Suez, all the way down to Singapore. We can't afford it. That's when the Nixon Doctrine kicked in, 2 years later, 3 years later. And under the Nixon Doctrine, Iran, under the Shah, was made responsible for Gulf security. And the Shah told me in 1973, we are going to become a nuclear power. It's inevitable. So there's nothing new about the mullahs wanting nuclear power. They started as soon as they took over. They started making deals with Pakistan to get a nuclear wherewithal. So, I mean, what's going on today doesn't shock me. And the Israelis, many Israelis I know, understand this. But Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you know, has made this an existential crisis.
And that's the question I think a lot of people are asking right now. Is this almost manifest destiny, if you will, towards becoming a nuclear power has existed in Iran? They have the capability to make the fuel for these nuclear weapons. What has prevented them from doing that up until this point right now?
Well, to begin with, you should put yourself in Tehran in the shoes of a Democrat or a Republican or a fascist or a communist. It doesn't matter. You look at a map of the world and you have 6 of the world's nuclear powers around Iran. Israel to the west, Russia to the north, China to the northeast, India and Pakistan to the east, and the US Fifth Fleet to the south. So anyone in Tehran today looking at the future of the world would want to achieve nuclear capability. I've never found that extraordinary. Of course, the mullah regime did threaten Israel in an outrageous way, and you put yourself in the shoes of the Israelis. It is an existential crisis because they may not survive one shot. It's all very well to tell them you can destroy Iran in retaliation, but what would be left of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem? I think you have to...
But is that what has prevented the Iranians from developing the nuclear weapons at this point? The fear of attack, not necessarily from the United States, but from Israel? I think that would be the most immediate attack.
It's nuclear deterrence, really. And today when people... I talk to my Israeli friends all the time about the threats that emanate from Tehran. I said, well, what about the threats that we had to face, starting with Mao Zedong, who said there were 800 million Chinese at that time. He was talking about the post-nuclear war complexion of China. We will have 400 million people left. Mao said these things. That was an existential crisis for the United States, if they become a nuclear power. And they did become a nuclear power, and they assumed a certain amount of responsibility that went with it. Same thing happened under Stalin. Stalin said the most outrageous things about what would happen in the next nuclear war. As soon as they achieved nuclear capability, shortly behind us, the tone changed completely.
As far as anything other than the tone, though, nothing really would change if Iran did have nuclear weapons capabilities?
I don't believe so. And they also know that Israel can indeed flatten Iran.
And it's a fact that Iran doesn't want to use these nuclear weapons. Obviously, that would assure their destruction. But there are some folks out there who say that Iran might use these nuclear weapons, give them to terrorists, because we already know that it's state-sponsored terrorism. Is that the greatest threat?
That's a legitimate fear, obviously. I don't think you can reverse what Iran has been working on since the days of the Shah. And they've spent a fortune to achieve a nuclear capability. And today the agreement, as far as I'm concerned, is just postpone the inevitable.
It's just postponing the inevitable. And so what then does happen is we hear comparisons a lot to the North Korean model. But I think maybe a more accurate model is the Pakistani model, where it's basically they just want to extort money from Western powers. And that's the real motivation behind getting this weapon. Do you agree?
Pakistan had to develop nuclear capability because of India. It was obvious that India was moving in that direction, and Pakistan did the same thing, which for them was very difficult. They were much poorer than India. And today, incidentally, Saudi Arabia has a deal with Pakistan. I was there in 2003 in Islamabad when the king flew in with 3 jumbo jets full of Saudi officials We couldn't understand what was going on. They spent 24 hours there and then went home. That was when the deal was made. So the Saudis know that if Iran develops nuclear capability, they are assured of the same thing.
So there will be another deal between the Iranians and the Saudis, you believe?
Absolutely.
And what does that mean for the makeup of the region? Because, you know, you have two very different centers of power, the Shia in Iran and the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I've been covering the Middle East on and off since 1950, 30 of those years with Newsweek. And if there's anything I learned about that part of the world, is its unpredictability. All the things that you've been forecasting in your career turned out to be wrong or half right. It's very, very difficult to forecast the future in that part of the world. You've got the civil war going on in Syria. We were thinking of getting involved in Syria until we discovered that it's basically Al-Qaeda and its associated movements that now have the dominant side of that war. And Iraq, which incidentally cost us, you know that figure as well as I do, $1 trillion. Both wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, each $1 trillion. To achieve what today? Al-Qaeda is now dominant in Western Iraq as a base for fighting in Syria. So I think we're well out of this. And people who said we should be involved in Syria, I think is the height of madness.
Arnaud de Borchgrave, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.